Before we get stuck into the Bible, though, I thought I'd start by doing some heresy. If you're up for it, great. You're not supposed to whoop that. Whoever whooped the heresy. It's not a good start, is it? Okay. Anyway, it's important that we're clear on what heresy actually is. It doesn't just mean bad theology, because there's loads of that around. Not tonight, obviously. Heresy refers specifically to claims about God that are so incorrect that the church has officially condemned them. So you have to be not just bad at theology, but incredibly bad at theology to be officially labeled a heretic by the church. Heresy is essentially the toxic nuclear waste of theology. Now this guy is going to appear on your screens in a second, was called Marcion of Sinope. He lived in the 1st and 2nd century and was so bad at theology that he's not just a heretic, but has got a whole type of heresy named after him. So, what did he do that was so bad? Well, Marcion claimed that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were different gods. He claimed that Jesus had come to undo the work of the vengeful Old Testament God. Now, hopefully, you won't hear outright Marcionism like this being preached in churches nowadays, and if you do, run away. But you've probably heard some things said in church that are basically Marcionite. Hopefully not this church. Have you ever heard someone say that the God of the Old Testament is angry and vengeful, but the God of the New Testament is loving, kind, and compassionate? Have you ever heard anyone say that ancient Judaism was basically full of rigid legalism? And then Jesus comes along and starts Christianity, a religion of love, grace, and freedom? It's all basically Marcionism. The idea that there is somehow a different God in the Old Testament and the New Testament. That the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament do away with those in the Old Testament. And again, let me be really clear about this. This is literally heresy. And I say this because it can be really tempting to think of the Old Testament as if it's non-essential world building, like the Silmarillion to Lord of the Rings, or Fantastic Beasts to Harry Potter, but it's not that. There's around 31,000 verses in the Bible. Around 23,000 of them are in the Old Testament. It's about 74%. The Old Testament isn't the Silmarillion. It's more than the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers put together. It isn't Fantastic Beasts. It's basically the first 5 Harry Potter books. This is important because the God of the New Testament is the God of the Old Testament. He hasn't changed. He hasn't gone back on his plans or his promises. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Marcionite ideas about the New Testament undoing the Old Testament would have us believe that God changes, that he's unreliable, fickle, untrustworthy. Thankfully, we know that's not the case. And we need to keep that in mind as we read the Old Testament together this week and next week. So, you ready? The Christian Old Testament starts with the Pentateuch. Pentateuch basically just means 5 books. And the 5 books in question here are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis starts with the creation of the universe. And right from the outset, God is not who we'd expect him to be. In the ancient Near East, creation stories were often very similar. God, or gods, would create the world by bringing order to some pre-existing chaos. This often looked like a violent battle defeating a sea monster, because water and the sea were signs of chaos. Not in Genesis. There's no violent struggle to create in Genesis. God simply speaks. And it's important to notice that God's speech is the moment of creation. God doesn't say, "Let there be light," and then go and flick on a light switch. God saying, "Let there be light," is how God creates the light. In other words, what God says is. God creates reality by speaking it into existence. And this matters because it demonstrates from our very first glimpse of God's character in Genesis 1:1 that God is faithful to his word. More than this, it shows us that he is incapable of being unfaithful to his word. Because God speaking of a promise creates the reality where that promise is kept. God says, "I will not forsake you," with exactly the same voice that says, "Let there be light." The same power that holds the sun in the sky is the same power that will bring us home to him. As long as there is light in the sky, God is faithful. In contrast to this, the rest of Genesis gives us a series of stories about humanity's tendency to mess stuff up and be unfaithful. Adam and Eve are created as the very first humans. They ignore God and sin. They have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel out of jealousy. Generation after generation sins and turns their back on God, leading to God sending a worldwide flood in Genesis 6 in the hope it will break the cycle, a sort of factory reset. As you might have noticed from watching the news, it doesn't work. Humans continue to be arrogant and sinful. And then, in chapter 12, God appears to a man called Abram, who later takes the name Abraham. God tells him to head to the land of Canaan, which he's promised to him and his descendants. And over the rest of Genesis, we see 3 more big stories of human failure. First, Abraham disowns and then cheats on his wife Sarah before very nearly murdering their son Isaac. Second, Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob essentially blackmails Esau into giving him his inheritance and is then himself tricked by the father of a woman he fancies before literally wrestling with God and being renamed Israel, which means he wrestled God. Third, Jacob has a series of sons, including Joseph from the horrific Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. Not that that narrows it down very much. Joseph's brothers are jealous of him and his swanky coat, so sell him into slavery. Joseph ultimately ends up in Egypt, gaining the trust of Pharaoh until he's second in command over the entire nation, which is where the book ends. In the midst of all of this human incompetence, God makes a covenant with Abraham. Not a contract, a covenant. A contract suggests 2 people of equal standing entering a mutually beneficial agreement. A covenant is God's unilateral declaration to be on the side of specific people. And let me be clear, God does not benefit from it. It's not negotiated between Abraham and God, but simply given by God and declared to be the case. And remember, from the start of Genesis 1, when God speaks, reality comes into being. And so this is the pattern that Genesis establishes. God promises faithfulness to humanity and declares his faithfulness through covenants, despite humanity's persistent and unique ability to be generally awful. It's a pattern that continues throughout the rest of Scripture. Genesis, as we've seen, ends with Joseph, Abraham's grandson, as second in command in Egypt. Exodus picks up the story 400 years later, with the Israelites now slaves in Egypt. Pharaoh is worried about an Israelite uprising and so kills all newborn Israelite boys. One woman hides her young boy, Moses, who is then found by Pharaoh's daughter and raised as her own. As an adult, Moses encounters God, whose name we learn is Yahweh, which basically means life or existence. And this will be important in a few minutes. Moses encounters God in a burning bush and afterwards asks Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Pharaoh refuses. And so Yahweh sends a series of 10 plagues to Egypt, culminating in the death of all the firstborn Egyptian sons. The Israelites are told to sacrifice a lamb and sprinkle the blood onto their doorposts, sparing their firstborn sons. And this is called the Passover. Pharaoh has had enough by this point and expels the Israelites from Egypt. He then changes his mind and chases after them into the Red Sea. God parts the sea, allowing Israel through, before closing the river behind them, drowning Pharaoh's army in the sea. If you want more details, go watch The Prince of Egypt. Israel then spends 40 years wandering in the wilderness on the way to the land promised them by Yahweh. They survive by eating manna, a mysterious food that miraculously appears every morning, provided the Israelites only take enough for that day. And Israel agrees to be Yahweh's people, resulting in Yahweh giving Moses the 10 Commandments, which, if you've never read, are just there, I noted for the first time. A set of ethical rules that Israel is to live by. Throughout their years in the wilderness, the Israelites do lots of complaining and wishing they were back in Egypt, and even construct a golden calf, which they begin to worship. Yahweh gives Moses instructions for building the tabernacle. This is essentially a big tent where God lives. And Israel turns away from their idolatry, back to worshipping the God who has rescued them from Egypt. The book of Numbers carries on the wilderness narrative and sees Israel preparing to enter the promised land of Canaan. At various points in the book, the amount of Israelites are counted up, hence it being called the book of Numbers. And spies are sent into the land for the first time to see what it's like. They come back with scary rumors of giants, and so the Israelites refuse to enter the land. So Yahweh decides to just wait them out, essentially. The book ends with the first generation of Israelites having died and a new generation near the promised land ready to enter. Deuteronomy, the last book in the Pentateuch, recaps some of the key events that have happened so far, like the Ten Commandments, and mostly contains a series of sermons given by Moses to the Israelites about how they should behave in the land. One of the key verses here is Deuteronomy 6:4, which is also called the Shema, which is essentially the first word of the Hebrew text. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." The Shema functions as Israel's mantra as God's people. Rather than golden calves or pharaohs, they are to worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And this then becomes the standard against which Israel is measured. Are they worshipping God and God alone? So, if you're anything like me, you're a bit lost at this point, so let's recap where we're at. The Pentateuch, this is the first 5 books of the Bible, begins with God speaking all creation into existence and ends with his chosen people, Israel, on the cusp of entering the land promised to them. Along the way, we see 2 important points. First, humans are idiots. They have a tendency to mess things up in the worst way imaginable, to desire a return to slavery after liberation, to worship dead statues instead of the living God. Generally, to be unfaithful to the one who has called them. Second, and despite this, God remains faithful to Israel. The God who spoke light into being remains steadfastly committed to the covenant he has spoken into being too, because this is who he is, and because he cannot be otherwise. Now, you might have noticed I haven't mentioned Leviticus. A few of you might even be relieved about that. Because Leviticus seems to just be a list of obscure, pointless, and bloody ritual sacrifices that people have to do for all sorts of odd reasons, like your house being infected. That's a real thing in Leviticus 14. Hands up, whose favorite book of the Bible is Leviticus? Yeah. No one. It was the same in the 9 and the 11 as well. It's not just you, I promise. It's my second favorite book, though, just behind Hebrews in the New Testament, which, as we all know, is the best book in the Bible. But you see, Leviticus is deeply misunderstood. And this is a problem because we can't understand big chunks of the New Testament unless we understand this book. Hebrews assumes you know how Leviticus works. And Jesus' disputes with the Pharisees only make sense if you know Leviticus. And by the way, let me rant for 30 seconds. Jesus' issue with the Pharisees is not that they're legalistic because they follow Jewish law. Again, this is a basically Marcionite reading of Scripture. No, every time Jesus and the Pharisees have a discussion about Jewish law, Jesus always offers the stricter interpretation of Leviticus. Every single time, without exception. Jesus' issue with the Pharisees is not that they're legalistic, but that they're not legalistic enough. But that's another sermon for another day. So, because Leviticus is so important, but so misunderstood, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on it before we carry on with the story of Scripture. Now, if something is a binary, we say it's a strict either or. Either something is A or B. So these TVs, for example, they're either on or off. They can't be both somehow. In Leviticus, everything exists along a series of binaries, a series of strict either-ors. First, everything that exists is either holy or profane. If something is holy, it just means that God lives there. And so the tabernacle is holy because God lives there. The temple is holy because God lives there. The Sabbath is holy because God rests there. Profane just means common or not holy. The word has got negative connotations in English because of things like profanity, but it's not a bad thing to be profane. 99.99% of creation is profane in this way. My car is profane. This music stand is profane. Our cat is profane. That one is definitely true. Even Mo Salah is profane. It just means not holy in the specific way that we've talked about. So, everything is either holy or profane. Second, everything is either pure or impure. Sometimes you'll see this translated as clean and unclean. It's the same thing. Impurity is a thing that you contract as part of day-to-day life. I can't stress this enough. It is not sinful to be impure. Jesus was impure at various points in his life. Having sex, giving birth, caring for the sick, the dying, and the dead, all of these things and many more things besides make you impure. But they're also things that God literally tells you to do, and so they can't be sinful. It's not sinful to be impure or unclean. So, everything that exists is either holy and pure, holy and impure, profane and pure, or profane and impure. Everything that exists is always in one of these four states of being. Why does this matter? Why am I showing you a table? Well, it matters because impurity turns holy things profane. In other words, if something holy gathers enough impurity, it stops being holy, meaning God is no longer there. Imagine this happens to the tabernacle or the temple. God would no longer be able to be with his people. It would be a catastrophe. And this is why Leviticus is so concerned with treating impurity. And so while it's not sinful to be impure, it is sinful to willfully or recklessly spread impurity. Let's think of it this way. During the COVID-19 pandemic, no one would have thought it was sinful just to have COVID. It's not sinful to be ill. But if you know you have COVID and you start going around licking people, that is sinful and weird. There are three main sources of impurity, and they all symbolize death. First is corpses. Pretty obvious how that symbolizes death. Second is something called lepra. This is not leprosy. There are no lepers in the Bible. Not one. This word gets badly mistranslated in English for a variety of reasons. But lepra in the Bible refers to an extreme flaky skin condition where your skin starts peeling off. In other words, it makes you look like a corpse. And it's pretty obvious how corpses symbolize death. Third is loss of bodily fluids like menstrual blood and semen, which is seen to be symbolic of a loss of life. Again, all three sources of impurity symbolize death. Now, we learn in Exodus that God's name, Yahweh, shows us that he is life itself. He is existence. And so it makes sense that death, as the opposite of life, pollutes holy places so God can't be there. This is the central problem that Leviticus is trying to solve. So, what's the solution to this death impurity? More life. And this is where all those animal sacrifices come in. Leviticus is clear that blood contains the life of creatures. So Leviticus 17:11 says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." And so a sacrificial animal is brought to the tabernacle, is identified with the person bringing the sacrifice, and then killed. The blood of the animal is collected and brought into God's presence in the tabernacle, where it is purified. And through the act of identifying with the animal, the impure person is also purified. Blood is life, and as life, it is the perfect thing to cleanse the impurities caused by death. As Leviticus 17:11 continues, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you for making atonement for your lives on the altar. For, as life, it is the blood that makes atonement." This is the point of those animal sacrifices. It's not because God hates birds. It's to cleanse the naturally occurring impurities of Israel so that the holy places stay holy. I realize this sounds nuts. If you're new here today, bless you especially. We don't always talk about this. But this is important for understanding the Bible. Even though Leviticus doesn't have much actual narrative, Leviticus is a key point in the story of Scripture. It's in Leviticus that we see that Israel's God, above all else, wants to be with his people. He goes out of his way, above and beyond, to make provisions for this people so they can be together. And this is what Leviticus is about. It's not about an arbitrary legalism. It's not about rules for the sake of rules. It's about God making it possible for us to be with him. It's about God's unwavering love for his people and the lengths he will go to ensure that his people can be in his presence. The God who gives Israel the laws of Leviticus is the same God who sends his son to live on our behalf. When we understand Leviticus properly, we see that these two gifts are fundamentally the same gift. They are the gift of God's presence with us. That's the last thing I'll say about Leviticus, I promise. After the Pentateuch, we come to a series of books known as the Histories. This is the books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, which we had a whole series on not too long ago, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Where the Pentateuch covers from creation to just before Israel's entry into the Promised Land, the Histories cover Israel's entry into the land all the way up to their exile from the land again by the Assyrians. The Histories begin with Joshua, wherein Israel begins to conquer the Promised Land. It is quite a violent book and not an easy read, to be honest. In Deuteronomy 7, 1-5, when preparing to enter the land, Israel is told by God, you must utterly destroy the people in the land. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. And that is basically what happens. As I say, it can be a pretty uncomfortable read at times, if we're being honest. Throughout Joshua, the question of faithfulness to Yahweh takes center stage and becomes a more central component of Israelite identity than ethnicity. So, for example, in Joshua 6, Rahab, a Canaanite, and therefore a sworn enemy of the people of Israel, is spared destruction because she helps Israel and demonstrates faithfulness to Yahweh. By contrast, in chapter 7, Achan, an Israelite, is destroyed because he's unfaithful. The categories of Israelite and non-Israelite start to become a bit fuzzy and begin to depend in no small part on covenant faithfulness to Yahweh. The violence continues into the book of Judges, where Israel enters a destructive cycle of unfaithfulness to God, leading them to being captured by other nations, calling out to God, and then being rescued. After a while, they forget the one who rescued them, and the cycle begins again. In the midst of all of this, God appoints leaders over Israel called judges. But we start to see the first signs that Israel isn't happy with this, that it wants to be ruled by a king instead. And so it's in this context that the book of Ruth initially seems like a bit of a tangent. It follows another non-Israelite woman, Ruth, who, despite her ethnicity as a Moabite, demonstrates faithfulness to Yahweh, Israel's God, by marrying an Israelite man called Boaz. But the narrative of Ruth ultimately connects with the wider story of Scripture towards the end of the book, where Ruth's descendants are traced to one of the most important figures in Israel's history, David. 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles all essentially tell the story of David and the aftermath of his life. In 1 and 2 Samuel, Israel is fed up with being ruled over by judges. Instead, they want a king like all the other nations. And so Yahweh reluctantly makes a man called Saul the first king of Israel. Saul is appointed by a prophet called Samuel, hence the book's been called 1 and 2 Samuel. Surprise, surprise, God was right, and it was a terrible idea. Saul turns out to be an awful king, and Yahweh essentially strips him of the monarchy and tells Samuel to anoint David as king instead. David is a shepherd boy from a humble background, but is described as a man after God's heart. He gains fame throughout Israel because of his victories in battle, most famously against a really tall fella called Goliath. And this popularity causes Saul to try to kill David out of fear he's going to usurp him. But when Saul is killed in battle, David is eventually anointed king over all Israel. David conquers Jerusalem, makes it Israel's capital, and tries to, but doesn't quite, build a temple in the city to replace the tabernacle as Yahweh's dwelling place. David is generally seen as an overwhelmingly positive ruler over Israel, but he is not perfect. At one point, he effectively rapes a Hittite woman called Bathsheba, resulting in her getting pregnant. David summons her husband, Uriah, and encourages him to sleep with his wife, so everyone will think the child is his. He doesn't, and so David has him killed in battle. It's David's son with Bathsheba, a man called Solomon, who becomes king of Israel after David's death. The temple in Jerusalem is finally finished under Solomon, and there follows a series of kings over Israel, some good, some bad. Whether they are good or bad is largely determined by whether they lead Israel to follow the covenant that Yahweh has established with them. Bad kings lead to idolatry and worship of other kings. Good kings, like Josiah, lead the people back to sole worship of Yahweh. The series of good and bad kings is recounted in 1 and 2 Kings, and then retold with some slight tweaks in 1 and 2 Chronicles, but it's essentially the same story. During this period of monarchy in Israel, in 922 BC, Israel enters into a civil war and splits into 2 kingdoms. A northern kingdom, also because nothing can ever be simple, called Israel, and a southern kingdom called Judah. In the 8th century BC, the Assyrian Empire begins to emerge as a dominant political and military force in the ancient Near East. And in 722, the empire captures the northern kingdom, which then becomes a vassal state. This essentially means it becomes part of the empire. In 701, the Assyrian Empire besieges Lachish, the second most important city in the southern kingdom after Jerusalem. In 597, Jerusalem itself is attacked. Judah's king is captured and replaced by an Assyrian stooge. It's then attacked again in 589 to 587 and completely wiped out. The temple is entirely destroyed. God can no longer be with his people, and the population are exiled to Babylon, Assyria's capital. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which may well originally have been written as one long book, tell the story of Israel's time in exile and their return. They make it clear that faithfulness to Yahweh's covenant is key to the restoration of Israel. Nehemiah 1:7 says, "We have offended you deeply, failing to keep the commandments, the statutes, and the ordinances that you commanded Moses, your servant." Through faithfulness, Israel is eventually released from captivity. They return to the land and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem in the book of Ezra, and then build a wall around the city to protect it from future attack in Nehemiah. And all of this leads us to 3 books that don't quite fit in with the rest of the story. The first is Esther. Along with Song of Songs, which thankfully I am not talking about today, Esther is the only other biblical book that doesn't mention God explicitly. It tells the story of a Jewish woman called Esther living in Persia. She becomes queen of Persia and discovers that one of the king's advisors is planning to kill the Jews. She exposes the plot and convinces the king to spare her people. The lack of explicit mention of Yahweh in the book is often understood as a comment on how God can work in unseen and indirect ways through other people and events. Second, we have Job, one of the wisdom books. It tells a story of a righteous man called Job, whose life Satan makes absolutely miserable by killing his family and taking all his wealth and possessions. His absolutely useless friends give him absolutely useless advice for about 35 straight chapters as Job tries to wrestle with the nature of suffering and how God could allow it. Not that we get any easy answers. Third, and finally, we have Psalms. This is a collection of 150 songs of various types, songs of praise, of thanksgiving, of lament, of anger. Many of them are said to be written by various people in Israel's history, like David. While they're probably not actually written by those people, the songs imagine how various people might have reacted to different events in Israel's past and give Israel a hymn book that reflects the totality of life's experiences, good and bad. So, That's Genesis to Psalms, and it's a lot, yeah? How are we supposed to make sense of all of that? Well, I think the first thing to say is that you're probably not supposed to. So don't put any pressure on yourself. God is infinite and limitless. We are finite and limited. This means that by definition, humanity can never even begin to comprehend the totality of who God is and what he's done. Something limited can never understand something without limits. Any God you can understand is, by definition, less than you. And so if you're listening to all these stories about who God is and what he's done, and you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all, it's probably a pretty appropriate response. It would be my response as well. Second, while we can never fully grasp everything about God, the stories in Scripture that we've seen so far do give us some important glimpses into who he is. Most significantly, we've seen that he is faithful to us. That this is a God whose very speech creates the reality it describes, in such a way that it is impossible for him to be unfaithful to his word. It is impossible for him to go back on his promises to his people. This is the nature of God. Unwavering faithfulness despite human incompetence. And so, if you're listening to this and you see yourself in the stories of human sin, suffering, and unhappiness, and I certainly do, these stories tell us that God has not forgotten his promises to you. That he is even now bringing them to completion. And so, we are going to enter into a time of ministry. Now, the band are going to come back up. There'll be people available to pray with you over here on my left, your right. Maybe the scope and breadth of Scripture has left you feeling overwhelmed, small, and scared. Or maybe it's left you in awe of who God is. Maybe you see yourself in the stories of human weakness. Maybe you feel as though God has forgotten his promises to you. Or maybe something completely unrelated to everything I've said has happened this week, and it's on your mind. Whatever's going on, we would love to pray with you and for you.